Was that all your notes?
Yes. So I took, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pages of notes. I only got, I'd say, 60% of the way through what.
Okay.
So, do you care to tell the audience what it is? What form of content? Well, maybe not what form. What content are you sacrificing to the content trough this week?
Oh, what I'm bringing to the altar, and what I was put on the FBI list, you don't have to, was the manifesto of Theodore John Kaczynski, which about a couple of weeks ago, I got very drunk and ordered all his stuff off of Amazon, of which the third book still has not come, and I'm pretty sure will never come. Because
you're now on a list.
Well, because about 4 days ago, I ordered a different book, and that came already. So
what was the one that didn't come?
And I forget. It was his latest book from 2014, but I'm pretty sure it just like dog whistles environmental terrorism a lot. So I'm guessing I'm never going to see that. Also, I did notice it was coming from the UK, so maybe that's
customs.
part of it. Yeah, maybe it got stopped at customs. Maybe it's just never going to come here. I mean, I know
it could be the UK government too. I mean, they're a little bit more strict about press freedoms.
Yeah, I should probably just get Tor and look it up online. But
so wait, when was this? So we read. I got through about 60%. Industrial Society and Its Future: The Manifesto by our boy Ted K.
Yeah.
It says copyright 2018. Maybe that's just when this was printed. When is this from originally?
It was right after the initial bombings. He had sent it to, I think, the Washington Post.
So is this from the 70s?
It's from a while ago, yeah. I know. I mean, there's references in it to 1995, so I don't think it was that long ago.
Wait, when did this happen? I don't even know. I'm so unfamiliar with what he actually did.
Should we just Google this real quick? Because I honestly can't tell you.
I thought you would be the expert here.
Expert? No, I just like the ideas and the man himself. When did Ted K do the damn thing? Oh, they were just Ted Kaczynski. Oh, actually, no. One of the top searches was
it when Ted Kennedy killed the woman on the bridge?
Oh, was that when? Well, if you search when did Ted K, then Kennedy shows up, die. When did Ted Knight die? When did Ted Kaczynski get caught? When did Ted Kaczynski write his manifesto? So top 2 out of 4 for Ted K is Ted Kaczynski.
Well, it's also personalized
and then
to you.
Then Ted Kennedy again, and then Ted Knight again, and then Ted Kennedy. All right. Write his manifesto. 1995 was when it was published by the New York Times, September 19th, 1995.
So I was only 2 decades off.
Yeah, I thought 1970 seemed a little early, but yeah. One thing I do know, though, that's not in the book, it was from some documentary that She Shall Not Be Named was watching about this man. I'm leaving out all names.
I got it.
But she was watching, and apparently, so when he was, before he like did his bombing and sent the manifesto or whatever, he was living in his cabin. He saw like some guy litter in front of his house, and he followed him on his like bike or motorcycle or whatever, waited for the guy to go to work, went into his house, took a shit in his bathtub, and
that is, as the kids would say, based.
Yeah. So ever since then, I was like, who is this guy? I got to find out more.
My base understanding of the man is that, obviously he's very bright. Some of his stuff seems a little, after reading this all day, some of his theories seemed a little ill-formed, some better than others.
Some of it pretty prescient, pretty.
Some of it for sure.
Yeah.
I don't think it's hard to deny. There's one quote though that I literally wrote in the book. Oh boy, we'll get to it. To the best of my knowledge, and correct me if I'm wrong, he's obviously a very bright guy, studied at Harvard, was a math professor of some
PhD.
sort.
Yeah, he has his own. Some math PhDs have to cite him if they're working in the same field, which is a funny thing I used to see on the math subreddit.
And based on what I know, while at Harvard, he was subjected to, or he was a participant in some psychological studies and was unwittingly given acid, right? Which really fucked with his psyche to a great extent.
It was like almost a daily occurrence from what I understand at one point. Like, it was not like he was just given acid one time and like they just saw him. Like, he was like getting regularly dosed, unknown to himself, like about that, which
was this
I
part
really
of MK
also
Ultra?
just like outside of all this, like I wonder how like that feels, like that becomes your new normal. Like, oh, how come like you wake up one day and the CIA agent like missed his, woke up late and you're like, why am I feeling so different? Like,
I feel normal again.
yeah.
So, I mean, was that part of MK Ultra?
Yeah, that's from what I've seen and understood. I mean, that's not written about in this book. And as far as I know, I don't know if he ever knew that, like at the time of the writing of this, at least. I'm sure since he's been in prison, people have written him and told him that. I don't know if he was aware of it at the time, though.
Oh, it makes sense. I mean, a lot of that has only been uncovered in, more recent decades.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we might as well just jump into the meat of it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, he starts off pretty strong. I'd say the general thesis of this is what is in the first sentence. The Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. Pretty succinct.
Hey, I think he knocks it out of the park from the get-go.
Yeah. I mean, his other thesis, or I guess to go along with that, is that reform is impossible. I mean, he is, I guess, a quintessential revolutionary in that sense. He does not believe in the idea of reform.
Yeah, the system is too sick to be saved.
Oh, it's beyond just sick. It's just not even possible.
Yeah, it's not salvageable. You can't save it. Like, you can't, because I think, I mean, later on, I think he makes a point. I don't know if you got to it, but like basically any reform would be coming from within the system, and it kind of is self-defeating for that reason. He gives a couple of reasons, like using technology to defeat technology is like, you're not getting rid of technology at that point. You're just still using it,
Yeah, I mean, there were some other salient points that he gets to later that we'll cover, but yeah, reform is not possible. He also states that the bigger the system is, and we're talking about like a technological society, the bigger the system is, the harder it falls.
Yes,
and it's better to fall sooner rather than later. Hence, I guess the emphasis of fuck reform, because you're just prolonging the harsher inevitable the longer it goes on.
Yeah, he makes the point that, there is going to be pain and suffering in this revolution. That is undoubtedly true, which I think is undoubtedly true of all revolutions. There are kind of people who, suffer lesser quality of life after the fact or during the revolution at least. But I think his point is that as technology progresses and people get, I guess, more used to the technology, more comfortable lives. And
they make concessions towards technology as opposed to technology will never make concessions to you, or rather the technological industrial society will never make concessions to the individual, and that human behavior and psychology will always only make concessions to society and what society demands.
Yeah, but whether or not it's a revolution or it's just that the system eventually is unable to sustain itself at some point, which is an inevitability in his view, that either revolution is going to happen or the system's just going to run out of gas at some point. We're going to run out of resources to keep this thing going. Then there's going to be a lot more pain. And if we wait to that point where there's just no more resources to keep this thing going, that is going to be a steeper downfall than if we stop now via revolution and end the system now. So we might as well just rip the Band-Aid off.
Yep. He does touch on, considering this was written in the 90s, yeah, he does touch on climate change and environmental activism and the like, which we can end on. But to start things off, outside of his thesis, he does focus for a little bit in the beginning on the psychology of modern leftism, and I had a lot to think and say about that, because his conception of, and maybe this is, it's hard to believe that someone as, intelligent and bright and as he is, because he's still alive, right?
He's still alive. He's
Yeah.
in prison. He is apparently dying
Okay.
of some sort of terminal cancer at this point.
I saw that he was moved from the Supermax in Colorado to elsewhere, some other federal correction facility.
Yeah. I do want to say, before you get too into this, in the second half of the book, he hedges a lot on this. And he says that a lot of individual leftists he knows, might not embody any of this, but this is really more of a critique of that, I guess, cultural leftism, or like as you see it, like as it moves through culture and media, and like how I don't know, you might want to say like Twitter leftism or something, or like some sort of social media leftism.
Beyond my biggest critique of it, of this portion,
it's not like beyond reproach. Yeah,
his prolific use of leftism as opposed to just saying liberals, because I don't know, like obviously there's some parts of leftism that are embodied in a lot of what he says are socialist, collectivist, politically correct types, feminist, gay and disability activists, animal rights activists, and the like. A lot of that, at least to me, screams nowadays, at least in 2022 lingo, as he doesn't like liberals. He doesn't like conservatives either, but this chunk of the book, it seems he doesn't like liberals.
Yeah, I think that's one reading of it. I think that's fair. Think too, this was written, or at least published in 1995. So it was probably written, the years leading up to it, back when, Democrats still had some reputation for being, a party that could actually do something for most people instead of, the hollow shell it is now. So it's still not inaccurate to consider, liberals, leftists, at least compared to today. Yeah, when I first read this a couple years ago, like I didn't get past that point. I was like, oh, this guy doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. But now, if you look at it as, just replace leftist with liberal,
it's a little easier to read.
It's a little, and it also, at least for like modern times, makes a lot more sense.
Yeah. Well, yeah, in a contemporary setting, because people even still say that, like I know. My parents and other people say like, oh yeah, they're to the left. It's just, no, you're not.
No,
yeah, buddy.
Right, yeah. To people like my parents, anyone who doesn't watch Fox News is to the left. It's like, if that's your definition, then actually, this would read as completely accurate, I would think.
Yes. All right. So to keep this going, he says the two psychological tendencies that underlie modern leftism. I'll say, okay, here's another gripe. He says, we call, quote, feelings of inferiority, and two, over-socialization. So throughout this, and maybe you can explain this, he frequently uses we and us. And I don't know if that is some like break in his psyche or whatnot. Instead of just saying I, he is constantly saying we.
Yeah, I think he means, at least from what I could tell, it was we as in like, this is a movement, like people on his side or people who agree with him already. I don't think this is like a split personality type thing at all. I don't think he had a co-author though.
And that was my other inclination. Like maybe he had a co-author in this. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe he did and it was just never listed or talked about.
Maybe he was using that language to throw off the feds.
Who knows? You could always write him a letter and ask. He still answers.
Okay. All right. That's good to know.
Yeah.
On his first point about modern leftism, feelings of inferiority, my notes on this screamed of like this like concept nowadays of that are like embodied by incels, fail sons, and just like liberals in general, like low self-esteem, depressed, defeatism. That's his conception of this feeling of inferiority that defines. I'm just gonna say liberals from now on. Like,
yeah,
that defines liberals. And so maybe the incel part doesn't fit, but
I will say not just liberals, but there's definitely a particular brand of leftists I think this sort of applies to as well. But I think liberals is probably more encompassing.
Yeah, right. So they have this feeling of inferiority that pits them against society in general, and it generally, it highlights their placement in society, and it's pronounced among amongst minority rights activists. They're like, you know, the way he uses them to, you know, say that, you know, a lot of groups are, say, hypersensitive about like their choice in language.
Mm-hmm.
You know, these are the types of people, you know, yeah, if you go on Twitter and you're looking at people who are saying like, you know, outdated, racist, stereotypical shit, it's just like, yeah, okay, yeah, I could see that they fit into this category, sure.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, they're typically going to be like, you know, who conservatives would say are snowflakes.
Right. And also kind of like who conservatives kind of hate for their canceling culture. You know, like you see someone say something wrong on Twitter and then you pry into someone's life to try to, you know, get them fired from their job or whatever. I think that would fit under his definition here. Like that sort of person has a feeling of inferiority.
Yes, and he furthers this by also saying that these most sensitive people are often, you know, the ones that aren't themselves oppressed.
Yeah, which also I think tracks pretty well.
Perfectly.
Yeah.
Perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
And he also says that leftists won't admit it, but they actually think oppressed groups are inferior, which...
if you're talking liberals again, that's like 100% spot on. And if you're talking
it's
about...
It's like the NIMBY shit.
Yeah, yes.
Like, they'll defend your rights, but it's just like, just you know, stay in your own neighborhood. Just, you know, let the whites stay to the whites.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's also like not even new for him to say. Like, there's the song "Love Me, I'm a Liberal." Like, that's the whole gist of it.
He also says that the left hates. Liberals hate the USA. I think that actually can be best prescribed to leftists. Actually, that leftists hate the USA and the West because the US and the West are strong and successful, and that ultimately the left doesn't like competition because deep down the left feel like losers.
Yeah, I don't remember all of this, but yeah,
I think
that was one of those ones where I might have rolled my eyes slightly.
Yeah, this is his paragraph 16.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, just a side note, but more books should number their paragraphs. Makes it so much easier to find exactly where you're at.
Especially when it's printed by different publishers. Yeah, it's the very last line.
The left is antagonistic to the concept of competition because deep inside he feels like a loser. Yeah.
It's pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this stuff is good in general, I'd say, but he is way off on a lot of other fronts. Like, you know, he's in prison because he killed people. I mean, he's not like the best dude ever. Okay, so moving on to his other like way of defining generally liberals is an over-socialization.
This one I think is a little bit more accurate than I mean, there's parts of the feeling inferiority, like we just talked about, that are accurate. And then the parts of like just feeling like a loser, I think you're playing armchair psychologist too much and it's just reading too much into it. But I think the over-socialization actually applies to a lot more people than just liberals or leftists or...
And he does rely a lot, it seems, you know, some of the academic citations he relies on, it seemed tend to be from psychology. And, you know, I haven't looked at the citations and whatnot. I'm not going to edit him in that sense.
What I do appreciate, though, about, you know, giving footnotes, like it's him saying, like, all right, just assume what these other people say is true. What's the implication of that? What's the logical end?
Right. All right. So his note on over-socialization, paragraph 25, he says that some people are so highly socialized that the attempt to think, feel, and act morally imposes a severe burden on them. And in order to avoid feelings of guilt, they continually have to deceive themselves about their own motives and find moral explanations for feelings and actions that in reality have non-moral origin. So that is how he defines over-socialization. And generally, he then continues in paragraph 26, over-socialized person is kept on a psychological leash and spends his life running on rails that society has laid down for him. And in these people, the result is a sense of constraint and powerlessness, which also tracks.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, most people only choose from a number of already socially acceptable paths for their life. You know, most people don't go on the beaten path, or at least choose one that's already been trailblazed by someone else. It's very rare to be a completely original person. Yeah. And it's even rare. Well, I wouldn't say it's rare, but I would say like 90% of people just, get a job, get married, try to buy a house, have some kids. I would say that describes, the mass majority of people. And I do think the idea of going to work every day and not retiring and, not having any hope of retiring for a lot of people does induce a sense of powerlessness. I think that's an obvious conclusion from that. I mean, he's working in 1995 when things were a little bit better and brighter too. I think
it was the Clinton era. There was government surpluses.
Yeah, but so I think this is even more of a sense of powerlessness now because there's just like no, I don't know, pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. You're gonna work, except there's no guarantee that it's ever gonna stop. You might just work till you're dead, and you have no other option except to work and to keep doing what you're doing.
And it all stems, in his point of view, from this like lack of autonomy and a stepping outside of what he calls the power process, right? So the power process is defined as 4 things, right? You're setting goals, the effort that goes into achieving that, the actual attainment of the goal, and then the 4th is the autonomy that you have, or a sense of autonomy, in doing that. You're not just like...
That's kind of overarching all 3. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. You don't have that in our society, according to him, which I would agree with.
And if you do, it's only like almost like a simulacrum, right? It's there, but it's very fleeting and it's not true.
It's hollow. It's you're making up. Yeah, well, that's I think the next part. So
there's what he calls surrogate activities.
Yeah, so the next part relates back to this over socialization a lot. But yeah, so the fact that you don't get to work and set your own goals and have power over those own goals or how they're done. Most people, you're told what to do at work. You might have a say in how that's done, but there's also a good chance, and more likely, you don't. And that goal too is not to like put food on your table or to keep shelter from, over your head or to fend off the elements. It's this really weird indirect way that you have to earn money so that you could pay other people to do this other hollow power process procedure so that they could fill your needs. So that it's like you're both trading each other, like each other's autonomy with each other. So it just feels worse for each person. Like I have to work to make money so that I can go to a grocery store and buy food that someone else grew, right? So, I mean, maybe a farmer probably has a little bit more autonomy because they probably feel like, all right, if shit went down, I could at least feed myself.
There's some sense of being able to sustain oneself.
Right.
And one's biological needs, like what he deems as like, I mean, he clearly is biased. Like he prefers a primitive,
yes.
Like the life of a primitive man is what he would call it.
Yes.
Yeah.
But for most people, you live in the suburbs, you live in a city or whatever. If you lost your job or if there was just no food coming into the grocery store, one of those two things, how are you going to, eat after a certain number of after your funds are out? You don't really have any say. You don't have any autonomy.
Look at the shelves in the grocery stores in capitalist Russia right now. They're empty.
Yeah.
But yeah, and that sense of autonomy that is not there in fulfilling the power process, right? It can be achieved, but only in what he calls like this surrogate activities, right? So, say you do have some office job, say you're a bureaucrat, you're doing as you're told because you are getting paid well enough and it's putting food on the table, but you don't have that sense of fulfillment. So, you're only doing those things that you enjoy. Let's say you go play fucking jazz saxophone on, you moonlight as a jazz sax. Ron Swanson, right? Mm-hmm. Like he does that for fun because he enjoys it. Mm-hmm. Like that's where he's getting that sense of fulfillment, and that's where his sense of autonomy comes through and shines through in his life.
Right. So like most people's hobbies qualify as surrogate activities. And I mean, I really hate having read this part actually, just because now,
and now we share it with the world.
Yeah. But, like a lot of times I'll be doing something. I'm like, oh God, like this is just a surrogate activity. Like this is pointless. This is not helping me at all. Like the other week, like I just got Elden Ring and I got stoned down playing it, and I'm having a great time. And my cat is like watching my guy, chase out after a rabbit. And like, I'm just like making a dumb joke, like, oh, don't worry, Appa. Like I got to do my hunting virtually too. I joked and I laughed about it. And after I was like, oh, damn, that's depressing. And like, that's all I can give her too. Like I realized like it's not just humans, I think, that suffer. Like at least domesticated animals, their whole lives are surrogate activities. They don't hunt unless you're
a cat can though.
They can, sure.
A dog would. Dogs. I mean, domesticated house dogs. You want to call them that? They are completely a human creation. They would not. Some would.
Sure.
Most would die off without us.
Yeah, and I think cats after a certain amount of that domestication, like inside, they probably wouldn't survive either. But like right now, my cat's still young and still like tears my shit up. Like it's not afraid. And if she got outside, I have no doubt that she would like chase down the first squirrel she saw. But she has to, be content with chasing the string instead. And I think that's actually pretty much most human life now.
Oh God, chasing the string.
Yeah.
Ooh. Well, yeah. I mean, he clearly says that a lack of autonomy has negative consequences. Yeah. All right. So what's another good quote? Well, let me just go to paragraph 45 because this is where it comes up. So there's good reason to believe that primitive man suffered from less stress and frustration and was better satisfied with his way of life than modern man is. It is true that not all was sweetness and light in primitive societies. Okay, so here's one thing coming up that maybe is just a symptom of this time, but he said, abuse of women was common among the Australian Aboriginals. Transsexuality was fairly common among some of the American Indian tribes. But it does appear that generally speaking, the kinds of problems that we have listed in the preceding paragraph were far less common among primitive peoples than they are in modern society. Why the trans jab there? Why is that a problem?
Yeah, I was okay with this until I learned he was a TERF.
Is he?
I don't know. Okay. I'm just saying because
I guess he is. Yeah. I'm not trying to put this guy in a shine him in a good light because he did murder people indiscriminate murder. So not a good guy. You got to separate the art from the artist.
Yeah.
I guess.
The idea from the thinker.
Yeah. All right. So he continues, we attribute the social and psychological problems of modern society to the fact that the society requires people to live under conditions radically different from those under which the human race evolved, which I think I know that you can agree with this. Like, I know that we share similar desires to just kind of not necessarily live off the land, because you do math and computer engineering all the time, like you don't want to completely divorce yourself from it because there are certain aspects, I'm sure, of like the problem solving and whatnot in that realm that you still enjoy. You don't want to get rid of completely, but there is a certain gratification. I was doing carpentry for a while. I know you've built things in the past. There is that primal, like, human element that is satisfying in a way that other types of work can never match. But I also don't want to throw out the idea that, all technology is bad, no matter how much he frames it in a bad light.
Yeah, I mean, there's parts, I think it might be past where you got to, but he defines two different types of technology, and one of which is really the problematic one, and the other one he thinks is impossible to get rid of, but he doesn't think is as big of an issue. But having left that aside, so what you just said, I agree with. I think this really goes, I think what he calls like a lack of autonomy, I think is really just similar to like alienation of labor. Like people don't have a say over what they get to do or what they're working on or how to do it. And it's not for them either. They don't own the product. They don't own what they're making. They don't have any say in it. So, your efforts only going as far as so you don't get fired for the most part.
So on that, I'm really curious to know, and maybe we will write him. I am curious to know, in all of his decades now that he's spent in federal prison, has he actually spent any time, and I'm guessing he probably hasn't, but he has access to libraries, I know that prisoners do, has he read any actual like leftist thinkers? Has he read Marx? Has he read Engels?
What I understand, his latter book from 2014 was after he read like most of Marx. So I assume.
Have you read that yet?
No, that is that's the book that got held up at customs.
Oh boy, because a lot of this, as you mentioned, like does feel like an alienation of labor and like a segmentation. You know, like the Ford kind of, God, what the fuck is it called? You know, what did Ford introduce into the assembly? Oh, the assembly line kind of system.
Oh,
like,
yeah,
you're assembling one part. You're not really like being considered as part of like the whole. It very much screams that he is not really considered, you know, and I'm still very much a novice when it comes to like Marxism, but like historical materialism and dialectics and like the, you know, he does talk about historical trends, but in very broad strokes, he doesn't consider it, and like he doesn't consider class struggle in the slightest, and like, you know, these opposing forces of, you know, power and wealth accumulation.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think if you asked or pressed him on it, I think he would say these are obviously bad things, but at least in this manifesto, he doesn't really touch upon it at all. One other thing, though, relating to what we were just talking about, there's I think, corollary concept from Marx in like one of his early writings. He calls it's species essence, and it's basically like just the drive that most people have to want to work or to create.
You said this is Marx?
Marx, yeah. Okay. Species essence. Now, it's been a while since my college class, so I may be butchering it, but I remember that being the gist of it, that it's like, that's the closest Marx comes to really like defining human nature, just that people left to their own devices will build something or create something or want to work on something, even if it's just as little as like, you know, what you have to do to make your life a little bit more comfortable. Like you probably, if you were just stranded in the woods, you would probably start making a shelter and trying to set up an environment where you were protected from the elements a little bit more than just sleeping on the floor, the forest floor.
Well, he's not just shitting on liberals in this. He does make one little quip about conservatives, and he says, conservatives are fools.
Yeah.
They whine about the decay of traditional values, yet they enthusiastically support technological progress and economic growth. And apparently, it never occurs to them that you can't make rapid, drastic changes in the technology and the economy of a society without causing rapid changes in all other aspects of the society as well, and that such rapid changes inevitably break down traditional values.
This I want to send to my parents. No, I think this is right. I was thinking about this on the drive over. Like, he has a lot of stuff critiquing the left in this, even later on. I think in the second half he didn't get to yet. There's another like portion where he talks about more leftism stuff, or the problem of it. Like, it's an inability to solve this problem. But I think that's because he actually respects it a little bit more. Like, he thinks that at least they're trying. It's just that they have some fundamental problems that they'll never be able to fix what he sees as a problem. Whereas the right, he doesn't even give a critique because it's just pointless, because they got their foot on the gas. They want this thing to go, go, go. And the whole time they're, you know, running over people like, why is my windshield getting so bloody? You know?
Yeah, but if they install windshield wipers, they can keep getting more and more blood, and, you know, whatever happens behind them, so be it. And if it affects the drivers behind them, so be it.
Eventually, they'll just get their Tesla to drive. They'll be able to turn their driver's seat back, and they don't have to look at what they're doing.
Yeah, it's all good. It's all good. In this chapter on the sources of social problems, he also continues that modern man has, through technology, change imposed upon him. Whereas a frontiersman, at least he was using America as the example, like an American frontiersman, say, you know, in the 18th, 19th centuries, they were changing things to their will. But now it's reversed in many senses, that change is forced upon modern man. Yes. Okay. I found where you are. Yeah. I think that's 57.
Yes. I think that's actually a pretty good point, because that is how at least I feel like life is now. Like, new technology will come out and you might not like it at first, but if it's suitable to profit margins, then eventually enough people will be using it to the point where you will have to use it too to be a functioning member of society. I mean,
how much money did you make on crypto?
Yeah, that's just, I'm trying to live off the grid with that money though.
In continuing with the I kept writing in my notes PB for power process.
Oh yeah, that's one. I think one of his better concepts here. Or I think it's an easy one for most people to get their head around. And I think if you just said that to the average person, they would be like, "Oh yeah, that makes sense."
Yeah, and if you told them who said it, they'd be like,
"Oh no,
no." So before I lose my train of thought, there was one thing, and I don't know where it is exactly. We'll come on it soon enough, but it did not, it did not escape me that what exactly he was talking about. Yeah, quite ironic. The concept of the show that we're recording right now is all about the consumption of content, just because it started out because I consider myself a little content piggy, especially during COVID. I've just been consuming, maybe because I just dipped back into old habits from childhood, watching TV while I was doing homework and staying up till like 2 a.m. and getting like 3 hours of sleep in high school and just consuming content. And then COVID happened and, all I was doing was like, well, work's over. I got nowhere to go. I guess I'm just going to watch TV or going to watch a movie. I'm going to play video games. It does not, the irony does not escape me that everything being talked about in here is, I guess, the antithesis of what this show is. So every episode hereafter, I think will be a little bit more light and airy compared to this one. But just know that the irony does not escape me.
I do like that the first episode shits on the rest of the series preemptively, though.
Yeah.
He talks about later though, like, and it's honestly, it kind of reminds me of like the spectacle, like to get the message out.
What's the guy, Guy Debord?
Yeah. I mean, to get the message out, he has to work within the system, and that's like the one concession he's willing to have to make. Like he doesn't like it, but like there's just no way around it that mass media communications are necessary for him to get his ideas out to the world. So.
Anonymous.
You could say the same thing about this podcast. It's just so important that we can take that little moral failing on the chin just to continue to push through and give the people what they want.
Yeah, Anonymous. I don't know that a lot of the hacking group, the hacktivists, if they don't seem to be too coherent nowadays in terms of like their grouping, but I know early on they seem to, be less opposed and antagonistic towards the press. They have this ethos of using the press to your advantage and using mass media to your advantage, despite, whatever feelings you may or may not have negative about them. Mm-hmm. Use it to your advantage. And that sounds like that's what he's doing here. I mean, he went about it in different ways. He wasn't toppling like the Tunisian government. He was murdering
toppling
people.
Buildings, yeah. But
was it buildings or was he just sending bombs to people?
I thought it was a building.
Wasn't that?
No, we're gonna sound so stupid.
Who was the other guy? The guy that bombed the like FBI building and killed like a bunch of people. Is that
the Unabomber?
No,
that's this guy.
No, it's not.
I don't know. I don't know. I just like the book.
No, Ted. Okay, Ted K.
Is this something we look up?
Harvard guy, math. I don't know if he was a math professor, but maths guy.
Yeah.
I don't know why I just did the UK maths thing. God, there was a guy in the 90s who blew up that federal building, the Oklahoma City bomber.
Yeah, that's it. That's it.
Yeah,
Yep.
Yeah. This guy,
he didn't even have a manifesto though.
No, I think he was just some right-wing nut.
Yeah.
If I had to guess. Moving on. The disruption of PP in modern society. Paragraph 59. So there's 3 groups of human drives that somewhat define the power process. Satisfaction with minimal effort, satisfaction, but only at the cost of serious effort. And then there's human drives that cannot, no matter how much effort is put in, you just they cannot be satisfied. So that sums up the human drives. Let's see. I also have my notes. The next paragraph. In modern industrial society, human nature drives tend to be pushed into the first and third categories, and the second group tends to consist increasingly of artificially created drives.
Right. So that's going back to his surrogate activities. The only things that, cost a serious effort for us to achieve are just these self-made things that don't really help us survive necessarily. Like, you want to run a mile in 5 minutes now. Cool. It probably will take you a while and a lot of serious effort to do it. But it's not something that is necessary to your survival necessarily. Or you want to learn how to play guitar or something. Once again, it's just something that you made up as a goal for yourself to take up your time, to take up your effort, because your food is otherwise taken care of by the money that you make at your job, which is where you don't have any autonomy. So this is some place that you do have autonomy, so you get some more satisfaction, I think. And I think that's why most people at least enjoy their hobbies a little bit, because one, they get to choose what that hobby is.
That's where their sense of autonomy comes from.
Right. They get to choose what it is, and then they also have to get to choose how to go about it, right? Like, do I want to play every day? Do I want to do it for how long, and to what degree do I want to like focus or just mess around? All that's up to you. Whereas that's really the only spot you have autonomy, though, for these things that are pretty much inconsequential.
Yeah, and he also notes that the more that there are drives that stem from this category of like the impossible, the more it's going to lead to, on a societal level, of depression and anger and frustration in the populace. Mm-hmm. And that society also pushes us towards those that are easily achieved with like minimal effort, like just going to the grocery store for your basic biological needs of, food and water. Well, I guess water through public infrastructure. But yeah, the society pushes us towards the first and third categories of the easy and the impossible.
Right. And the things that we need are now mostly in group one, at least if you're living in an industrialized society and have a modicum of income.
Oh, all right. One thing he mentioned that I just thought was interesting in this conversation of these like three drives. He mentioned something about like franchisees and franchise, like think of like a McDonald's or something like franchise, paragraph 65.
Right.
That apparently some of them, and I don't know if this still holds true, some of the franchise corporations make franchisees take some sort of, personality test, or just testing them as like a future franchisee to see if they have too much creativity or initiative in who they are as an individual, because the franchise corporation does not want that. They don't want like an independent like individual running the show who might, sway or stray from their necessity for obedience from their franchisees. I thought that was a little interesting. I don't know how true it is. I have to take everything what he says with a little bit of grain of salt, because some of it is not cited. But
I will say, though, that is generally pretty true now. If you apply to a lot of jobs that have automated hiring processes, there's like personality tests for a lot of them. And like, even I went to a recruiting company like a couple years ago, and not even for a job, just for a place to help me find a job. And I had to take a similar test, and it was like, I'm pretty sure to see like, are you too creative or too much of a, I hate using this word, like free thinker, or are you good at just doing what you're told and being, and like, if you just have half a brain, what the right answer is supposed to be. Like, oh yeah, I love taking, I love doing what I'm told and getting on time and leaving a little late.
You'll be perfect for the military.
Yeah.
Yeah, I took one of those things at one point as well, like a career counselor kind of thing. Mm-hmm. It was just like, this is after college, and I like couldn't find a job, and I was just like, I have no idea what the fuck I want to do. This is when I wanted to join the military, because I was a fucking idiot. Because
I remember that.
I was like Pete Buttigieg, right? I was gonna have like an upper middle class upbringing, and I was gonna do monkey bars because they were cool, and then I was gonna go into politics because I'm smart.
Woo! Yeah, I remember you were a sociopath like him.
God, yeah, maybe I still am. But yeah, that was a really stupid idea. But so anyway, I went to that career counselor, and like, it was so easy to take that test, like a questionnaire, and get the results that I wanted. Like, it came out and told me like, ooh, you should be in the military. It's like, oh no shit. Like, I answered the question, so I like, as a sociopath would. Like you can get the results you want on those sorts of things. But I can easily understand how.
I honestly can't imagine a person who answers those questions like 100% honestly. You know, like everyone knows that this is like a filtering process. Like the person making it is doing it explicitly as a filtering process, and the person taking it's like, oh, if I answer this wrong, I'm not going to be even get a call back. So obviously I have to like give the answers I think that the other person wants to hear, and everyone operates that way. It's so I think the whole thing just becomes pointless at that point. But I guess some people are like really hard, like, nah, I'm gonna come in when I want and leave when I want and do what I want, and I'm not gonna listen to what the boss says, and I'm gonna make a Big Mac with chicken patties instead, and you know, just like not do what the franchise wants me to do or whatever. Like, and I guess that weeds out a certain small part of the applicants, but I think most people know, you know, what the game is.
Yeah, well, and also even to get to that like franchisee level, you had to have some sort of like good credit or be established within the capital system and have capital and have the means by which that you would even be able to open a franchise, you know, to start. Mm-hmm. So I mean, there's probably already a baseline like selection bias, rather.
Yeah, or you're risking like all the money you have because you think this is your way out, and then like all of a sudden this becomes the most important thing in your entire life, like running some franchise, which is like just a depressing thought. Like,
yeah, oh god. Well, speaking of depressing, and powerlessness, he mentions like he in essence makes a joke about Homer Simpson without actually mentioning Homer Simpson. And considering this was in the 90s and maybe prior to the Simpsons at least being a thing, and he was living in the fucking woods, middle of nowhere. He didn't even know who the fuck Homer Simpson was. You know, he speaks about like that our lives are depending on other people's decisions and that we don't know who these people are. And that is where the sense of powerlessness derives. So, you know, think of like the nuclear power plant inspector and the safety precautions that a nuclear power plant might be taking or not be taking. And, you know, where we are, you know, there's power plants all up and down. Like they're all over. I don't know who the fuck works there. Mm-hmm. I don't know the engineers. I don't know where they went to school. You know, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, you know, I know that they have some smart people working there. They're also very much, there's a stranglehold from the industry on them. So there's certainly profit motive over safety going on in many respects. So yeah, there's going to be a sense of powerlessness. And when you have Homer Simpson type schmucks who are at the controls, mm-hmm. which, you know, I would like to think that those types of people aren't in control. I have no fucking clue.
I think also it goes beyond just like having people who are completely ignorant of like, you know, the monumental importance of their task, like a Homer Simpson in charge of a nuclear power plant. I don't know as much as that would be the issue, as much as it would be someone in that position who is willing to follow their boss's orders to dump the nuclear waste in a spot that they shouldn't, you know?
Right,
and that's the sort of person, and that's the sort of and that's the sort of person who would have to pass this personality test that, you know, that they're obedient enough. And if someone who's not obedient enough is never getting that job at that nuclear power plant because they would have a conscience telling them, hey, maybe I shouldn't poison this water supply.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, have you seen all the reporting in Hawaii that's been going on in the last few months? Mm-mm. So, I mean, this is nothing new with the Department of Defense, right? They pretty much, I don't want to speak in too broad strokes, but they poison like every community that they're near. Jesus. The Intercept has done a bunch of reporting on this. I think their reporter Sharon Lerner. Sharon Lerner does a lot of like reporting on the EPA and like toxic chemicals that have been introduced into the environment. The DoD is obviously, you know, a huge evil when it comes to introducing untested or even tested just chemicals into the environment. So most recently, I know PBS, you know, I watch the NewsHour pretty frequently. They've been doing a lot of reporting. The DoD in Hawaii have for a very long time been just dumping like chemical waste into water supply so that like I don't know how many people live in Hawaii, but a very large substantive part of the population has just been drinking contaminated water, you know, doing more than just drinking. It's profound. And, you know, Hawaii, like infrastructure there, I'm sure, to change it is not easy. It's a fucking island, or many islands rather. Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, the sense of powerlessness, like you're going up against not only, at this point, the state health authorities by way of the state of Hawaii, right? You're going up against the federal authorities, the DOD, and it's not like DOD plays nice.
Right. That I think is indicative of the type of person who passes a personality test, who is following orders and is doing what they know they shouldn't be doing. Actually, that reminds me of a story I read about New Jersey recently, where something like 800,000 people have had lead in their water without knowing it. And I think that is either not necessarily someone who is following orders, but maybe a Homer Simpson type who just never followed up on whether these things were fixed or replaced or what. Or maybe it was an order person who helped keep it under the covers. But almost 1 in 9 people in, say, New Jersey have been drinking water that had lead in it without their knowledge. And that too is a sense of powerlessness. Oh, I'm getting clean water from my sink. No, you're not. I mean that's also not anything new. I mean, we've seen a lot of stories about contaminated water in the United States over the past decade.
Flint's not even the beginning. Goes way back.
Right, and they're still having problems, aren't they?
Oh yeah, I mean their infrastructure is still fucked. I remember growing up,
which I think prolonged exposure to, like knowing it's a problem and then just nothing. having nothing done to help fix it.
I mean that happened during the Obama administration,
right? And then also having people, I think Elon Musk said he would fix it, right? And then that just happening, right? It's like I can't imagine, like the sense of powerlessness. The water is bad for you. You have people telling you they're going to do something about it, and then nothing just continues to happen.
That's also indicative of what's going to happen with climate change. We've known for since the 70s. People have been.
He knew in here.
Yeah. I mean, oh boy, we're fucked. Well, so he goes on to say that people are disturbed by deteriorating health and death, and a lot of that stems from never putting one's practical powers, like biological, prowess and whatnot. Like, if you're not a carpenter or like a skilled trades individual, right? You're not using, the skills that the human body had evolved and adapted over time. If you're not making use of those faculties, you've been deprived your whole life, and you're going to focus on, in essence, prolonging one's health and prolonging one's like physical appearance, because you never make good on being like, being an actual human and, making use of one's autonomy. And primitive man, he says or theorizes, like, never had such fear of death. It was just like an accepted part of the human process, right? And to what you said earlier, people, I think generally, not everyone, but generally people would be very happy to, be born, have a childhood, find a wife or husband, have kids, whatever the situation may be, and progress through these quote unquote, what he would say, stages of like human development. And death is just a part of that. But because we are so dissociated from this process, that we are not engaging in like quintessential human activities, that we are so far removed from it, that there is this existential fear of death.
Yeah. This is going to be kind of a maybe a far out dot to connect. Maybe there's nothing to it, but like
Peter Thiel and Blood Boys.
What?
Peter Thiel and Blood Boys.
No. Though, I mean, the immortality projects of most billionaires, I think that definitely correlates directly to this, because they became rich, sure, but they don't actually like exercise, I guess, the animal like side of being human.
Have you seen Bezos recently?
No.
The boy is buff.
he's still on the roids.
I mean, that man is
swole.
Yeah.
But what I was gonna say is the advent of existential philosophy as a philosophy really coming about like in the end of the 19th century and like the 20th century and now, to deal with the malaise that most people feel like, what am I doing? You know, like, what's the point of all this? And and I don't think it's a coincidence, or at least like it kind of dovetails with this, like with industrial society. Because before that, did you even have time to really think about what I'm doing? Like, no, you just worked on what you needed to work on to make sure you made it to the next day, and that was what you were doing, and that had
right. You hunted, or you gathered some fucking nuts and berries.
It was that second category of power process goals where you had to do serious effort to get a goal that was directly related to your well-being in some way. Most likely, I mean, like maybe you had time to do other goals, but for the most part, you had to at least, fend for yourself a little bit. Now they're all in 1 and 3, and now it's like, well, what are we doing? And what's the point of all this? This is just my own personal thought to connect. I've recently gotten into cold showers, and now I no longer fear death. But I do think like some people say, it does feel like very animal. Like the body is built to survive certain environments, but most people do live at least if you're living in America or an industrial nation, like you live in air conditioning, you live in shelter a lot, unless you're going outside and going to extreme heats. You live in a very narrow range of temperatures. Your body doesn't have to exert itself in a way where it probably used to have to do, 1,000, 2,000 years ago. So the cold showers is kind of like, besides it's bringing you right to that moment, because you can't think about anything else when you're
so you're just simulating extremes.
Yeah, I was thinking like it's a surrogate activity for sure, except my body doesn't know it. My brainstem can't tell that, So there is like this, after I get out, it's like, oh, I just survived something a little bit, which is stupid. It is dumb, but it feels good. And your brain, I mean, it does reward you a little bit for it. It feels great. I'm like addicted to them now. But I do think...
Is it a cold shower the whole way through?
I'm not there yet. No, I do a warm shower and then I crank it as cold as possible for about a minute. But
okay, I used to do that, but
yeah.
For the effect it has on one's pores, right? You open the pores with the hot water and you can clean your pores, and at the very end, the cold water helps to close things up. I don't know. It was a nice like hit of caffeine, for lack of a better word.
Wakes you the fuck up.
Oh, yeah. But see, that's the thing. I shower at night. And
I wouldn't do it at night. I do it first thing in the morning, and it wakes me up. I'm thinking I don't even need coffee anymore. I'm gonna just stop drinking and just do a cold shower first thing.
Holy shit! So I went on Lexapro for the first time in my life last week, and those first 2 days, like I've only ever had like the jitters from coffee. In college, when I had night classes, I would down like a large iced coffee prior to class, because it was like 6 p.m. Like, you gotta sit through all that, some of it pretty boring nonsense. My hands last week, holy shit, like just like, like a smoker who hasn't had a cigarette in like 5 days. Just it was kind of frightening, like how jittery I was.
Is it strictly an SSRI, or is it like an SSRI and like a stimulant, like a Wellbutrin, I think?
No, it's just an SSRI.
Okay.
I mean, it affects everybody
differently.
Differently. Sure. I mean, it also gave me wicked diarrhea.
Oh, God, yeah.
And given my GI problems, it has not been fun. Yeah. But yeah, caffeine. Yeah, I don't think I could ever cut caffeine. I even told myself, like, with all this jitteriness, like, I'm going to cut caffeine, because I think Zach had a similar experience. It's just like, I'm not doing caffeine.
Yeah.
No, I can't give it up.
I don't think I could give it up normally. Maybe with a 5-minute cold shower when I get to that point, maybe I'll be able to stop. But yeah. I mean, I drink like 3 cups of decaf at the work every day. Because like
decaf.
Yeah. I mean, like, because I know I shouldn't be drinking the caffeine, especially because I had like blood pressure issues in the previous time. But I'm just so used to drinking it that now I'm just like, I need another cup, even though I know the next one's not going to do anything because there's nothing in it. But it's just like, I don't know, maybe.
Well, all right. Well, let's finish. Let's read the end of this chapter. We'll end with paragraph 76, and then we're going to take a little break. So, paragraph 76. In response to the arguments of this section, some will say society must find a way to give people the opportunity to go through the power process. For such people, the value of opportunity is destroyed by the very fact that society gives it to them. What they need is to find or make their own opportunities. And as long as the system gives them their opportunities, it still has them on a leash. To attain autonomy, they must get off that leash.
I got nothing to add. I think he's
Good on you.
100% right. Yeah.
Good on you, Ted K.
Yeah.
All right. We'll be back.
You're muting all names?
Not all names. Our names, no.
Okay. Did we say our names?
No, I could do a voice. We could do it now. Yeah. I'm Josh.
I don't know if I want to give mine. As a person who works in technology, it would be probably not great for me. I'm still a slave to the system, I still need it for food. But, if I'm on another episode, and someone who sounds like me says that their name is so-and-so, that's not me. That's someone else. This is an actual book you would think would be like on the how there's like books that aren't taught in schools.
Yeah.
Is this on that?
I mean,
because if not, why aren't they teaching it? Or like, if you,
well, I mean,
he's being that teacher. Like, I'm just teaching like this.
But he does get to that, right? When we'll get to it, but about scientists and mathematicians and engineers.
Yeah.
Maybe we don't have to be so prescriptive about like how we go about the rest of these 2.5 pages, because shit, what was I saying though? Oh, engineers, mathematicians, scientists. He does reflect on these individuals, and my read on it was that the point he was trying to convey is that these people actually don't get any satisfaction from this work. It is all that like simulated. What was the terminology?
Yeah. It was another surrogate activity, pretty much.
A surrogate activity, right? Like a lot of that stuff is not actually, sometimes it's done for money.
Yeah.
To sustain their careers, and it largely is. But he help me here. He says,
science and technology constitute a powerful mass movement, and many scientists gratify their need for power through identification with that mass movement. So like a lot of them are enacting
religion
their
or something
power.
like that.
Well,
or
he does say like
university.
One way that people try to satisfy their power process is by being a part of a movement. Like he says that in general for people.
And you can share in the wealth that is generated. It's like psychologically through helping achieve the goals of the organization. And you felt like a small part of that. He didn't say it at any point, but I wrote just like voting, LOL. Like he kind of thinks of it like having a say, chapter 117, like having a say, like, or a sensation that you are part of something, and it being like kind of fake because you're just like collectively taking the energies of this mass movement and sharing a little bit in that goal achievement, even though individually you've likely had zero effect. And it kind of just screamed like, this allegiance to voting in regard to like sense of democracy, when democracy can still be achieved in other ways. Like voting is very ineffective a lot of the time.
Yeah, that's a really, I think, good one from start to finish, actually. Yeah, 117, the whole thing, I think, is actually one of the better paragraphs.
All right, well, let's just read it then. So, you want it or you want me to take it?
Yeah, sure. In any technologically advanced society, the individual's fate must depend on decisions that he personally cannot influence to any great extent. A technological society cannot be broken down into small autonomous communities because production depends on the cooperation of very large numbers of people and machines. Such a society must be highly organized, and decisions have to be made that affect very large numbers of people. When a decision affects, say, 1 million people, then each of the affected individual has, on the average, only a 1/1,000,000th share in making the decision. What usually happens in practice is that the decisions are made by public officials or corporate executives or by technical specialists. But even when the public votes on the decision, the numbers of voters ordinarily is too large for the vote of any one individual to be significant. Thus, most individuals are unable to influence measurably the major decisions that affect their lives. There is no conceivable way to remedy this in a technologically advanced society. The system tries to solve this problem by using propaganda to make people want the decisions that have been made for them. But even if this solution were completely successful in making people feel better, it would be demeaning. So yeah, he doesn't seem to have high hopes for voting.
Yeah. He's very he makes it very plain that he does not believe in the idea of small, substantial, like progressive reforms. He sees it as a lost cause, like because things will break. And I mean, he outright calls for like the technological society to break down because it is so bad that absolute revolution is necessary and it must be stopped now.
Yeah.
Because it ever so ever, foot by foot, like centimeter by centimeter, it is encroaching on the freedom to control one's own life is what he suggests. These small encroachments over time by technology necessitating itself and chipping away at those freedoms. And, he speaks in freedom.
Also, I mean, besides taking away your freedoms, depriving you of like your ability to do what's most human to him, which is enacting the power process in a meaningful way. That's just gone.
Having domain in one's life.
Yeah.
He speaks to like these small steps, like the introduction of the motor vehicle to cities, where previously in cities, people could walk to work. Like maybe the conditions weren't all the best. And I'm sure early on, especially in the Industrial Revolution, when there were pretty much no considerations for public health at that point. You had just smog filling cities. Not that LA is like any better now, but there's better, environmental and ecological laws and regulations that make life in a city somewhat better. I mean, there's still systemic issues, in cities now where a lot of indigent communities are breathing in toxic fumes from, being close to ports and trucks and shit. But he speaks to these slow encroachments of tech. So think of how a car changed a city. It introduced this layer to a city that is then impeding upon, not in like a Luddite sense, but the technology itself is impeding on just being a natural human. Like you can't walk anywhere anymore. It is a technology that is impeding on you and your choices in life because I didn't ask for a fucking car. And now pedestrians have to worry about death just for crossing a street in their own city.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's one. That's the way that technology is forced on people against their will that he talks about a lot. Just going back to 117, going back with like the voting. I mean, you just look at that in the context of.
I'm eating, by the way. So
yeah.
Sorry. Deal with it.
Think about what you would have to believe to think that in the last presidential election, for instance, that your vote would matter so much and was for a person who would so drastically change your life in the world for the better, instead of just some sort of demeaning act. I mean, I'm sure there are some people who like joyfully voted for Joe Biden, but
I was not one of them.
Yeah, like I feel like most people who voted is like, well, it's really just kind of just not Trump vote for the most part for a lot of people.
One of my friends, Jay, called me a dick because I voted for Bernie. And he's like, what do you mean? What do you mean? Like, what do you mean? Come on, man. Like, what did I do wrong? And he's like, well, you didn't vote for Biden. That's a vote for Trump. And I was like, come on, man. I know you're smart enough to know like that's not how voting works for the president. He's like, yeah, I know, but like you couldn't just do it. And it's like, if I was living in DC at the time,
because he felt demeaned and he wanted you to feel demeaned too for doing the same thing.
Probably, but I lived just in DC. To relate it back. It's the text, bluest of blue places.
Yeah,
like if Trump won DC, there are much bigger problems. You're looking at like a landslide the way of like who had that? Was it Nixon that had the landslide? Reagan?
Yeah.
Regardless, maybe it was
Reagan won like 48 states or something.
Except like what, like Minnesota or something.
Yeah.
It was like it was not gonna happen that Trump was gonna win DC of all places. So I was like, yeah, I'm not voting for Biden if I don't have to. Like, you know what? You keep telling me to vote. Like, fuck you. I voted how I wanted to vote. I'm not voting for Biden. Don't care.
Yeah. Yep. I did not either. But I mean, like, even if you did, and you think you were part of the solution, you were only that was successful in making people feel better. It would feel demeaning. So I don't know if you agree with that or not, but I think that does account for a lot of people who made a vote for Joe Biden and kind of like, I mean, just at the very least, not happy with the fact that that's their guy. You know, that's. I
mean, yeah, it's a lot of it is like just biting your tongue.
Yeah.
Oh, one thing he does say he when talking about the types of freedoms, and like his conception of like how he defined freedom, like, you know, constitutional freedoms can be like kind of loose and wishy-washy, and, you know, the speak of freedom is kind of has this veil of like this democratic country in a sense. But those freedoms are really meaningless in some ways. So like his definition of freedom was not what he said is not this bourgeois like talk of constitutional freedoms. He's talking more of like control and like domain over one's, you know, like sustenance and being in a bit more of like a you know, pre-industrial modern or pre-industrial human like community. 97. It was his only use of the word bourgeois. Like he had, he has some conception of like what the lingo is, it seems, but he seems ignorant to it in those first few chapters about liberals and leftists.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of this book is written sort of as his like attempt to convey ideas from a few other books. He says that like in the postscript, which I'm not sure is in that copy, but
there's some end notes.
Okay. Yeah, there's a postscript as well. That's like its own little like 2-page thing.
If we want to just keep going through this, the next part, my notes on this, this part I liked. Some principles of history, starting with chapter 99. So he defines history as being two distinct things. Like it's a combination of this erratic component that has no discernible pattern, and it just is a bunch of unpredictable events. Like, you know, let's say like I would liken this to like natural disasters and like volcanoes and stuff. You know, there's parts of history that we have no control over.
Right.
And then the other part of history in these two buckets, the other one is the more regular component. And he defines it as these long-term historical trends, largely through a technological progressivism or progress, I should say. So he focuses on the latter element, this regular component, the long-term trends in society. And he says there's these 4 principles to this type of regular component. And small changes, usually through like basic reforms, like societal like reforms and social reforms, things will usually revert back to the norm if the change is too small. There's this next category in principle 2 where if it's a sufficiently large change, it will likely alter society as a whole, right? Say like the introduction of like social media. I would liken that to that's a significant enough change created by the internet that has, you know, society as a whole, it's not going back.
Right. Yes.
So a small enough change, you know, in that ecosystem now, like you might not feel the ripple effects. Something new that needs to come along next is going to have to change a whole lot that exists right now. So he's in essence saying that if a large enough thing alters society, it's society as a whole that is altered. Right. The introduction of like planes, like say like how that changes.
Right. Stuff things. Where genie's been out of the bottle.
Yeah.
Like opening Pandora's box. Or
it is not, you can't put it back. It's kind of like nukes, right? Like we got them now. There's no going back. I mean, maybe there's some chance of change, like, you know, some sort of reform. Like he has this weird obsession, but maybe it's not weird actually, with genetic engineering and a fear of what that means.
Yeah,
right?
He brings that up a lot.
Which it's actually pretty conceivable. We already did it, right? With CRISPR-Cas9, there was that Chinese researcher who just a few years ago, I know the AAAS science podcast, they've covered this, as have, I want to say, Science Friction from the Australian Broadcasting Company. They've both done episodes on the Chinese researcher who, through the newly developed like CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing techniques, there was a set of twins who, in utero, he edited their, I guess, the embryonic cells,
the genes directly,
such that, because the father was, I believe, HIV positive. I don't know that it was a severe case. Maybe he was, being medicated and like, he was doing fine, as I understand it. But in utero, the researcher implanted something to the embryo, I guess, that whatever allows CRISPR-Cas9 to be effective as a gene editing technique, inserted into the twins a gene that would make them, I don't know, immune to HIV, but
more resilient in some way,
something like along those lines. He did not get any proper authority or whatnot to do this. So even when this came out, the Chinese authorities pretty much had him, like, I think, barred. They were just like, you should not have done this.
And what happened to the twins?
The twins, I think, are still alive and healthy.
So they were
as
born.
I understand it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
But
how do they have HIV or whatever?
I don't think so. I don't know. I would have to look. I don't want to speculate, but that's the story as I understand it. I don't know what other repercussions came of the researcher. But
yeah,
last I heard, people were not happy in the scientific community.
Yeah.
Nor in the Chinese government.
Editing our own code, essentially.
Yeah. And Ted K has a deep fear of genetic engineering.
But yeah, I think it has to do, it's like taking over socialization to the next level. I think you could, like, that's his general fear of genetic editing. Like, people changing themselves to fit a system is what he's most critical of, right? Like, system imposes change on the people, not the other way around.
And not just psychologically at this point, physically.
Right, on its most core level. Because you're going to have these gene changes made by scientists, and he already has listed out his criticism of science and scientists, that a lot of them are doing it either for money or as a means to sublimate like their power process in some way. And so that means that it is like
it all
really always
comes back to the pee-pee.
Yeah. And so editing your genes now is subject to that, the bias of either, money hungry or knowledge hungry, or just people who might be playing God and not knowing what they're doing, could, permanently alter at least a bloodline or something, whoever chooses to have something done. Yeah, I can see why he's so afraid of it with everything else he's listed out.
I think he sees this as the next frontier of technological progress,
right.
It seems.
You could,
that's the inevitable, like, if not the next up, it's within the realm of possibility. And this is like the next step in one's relation to technological progress. I think he sees that as like the ultimate, like the ultimate change, right? You can change society.
Or at least ultimate control. Like they'll find out what genes make someone obedient, and then they're just gonna make every baby that.
Sure. Yes. Let's get back to this principles concept, because this was actually,
I was just rereading it.
Yeah. So principles of history. So, as I mentioned, right, there's two components, right? There's the irregular, like, things you can't change that are unpredictable at history. Right. And then there's the regular, like, long-term trends throughout history. Right. We said that small changes.
And for that, he gives these 5 principles.
Yeah. And there's these small changes that, if they're not significant enough, things are just largely going to revert back to the norm.
Right. He calls that a tautology, too. It's basically self-evident. I mean, if it's too small to do anything, then it's just going to fade away.
Right. So 3, if we look at something large enough, where its effect is large enough. So think, the introduction of the internet, right? That is something we're not turning off. Those consequences, that have come by way of that change, they alter society as a whole. Like, it's not, there's this reversion to the norm doesn't exist anymore. Throw that idea out.
Not only that, I think just it eventually invades every aspect of your life. I mean, the internet in particular is something I did that.
Yep. And so more like theoretically now, he states that if it is large enough to alter society, the consequences are wholly unpredictable. Like no matter what you think you know is coming, you have no guarantees. Like nothing can be predicted.
He does say that if it's the same thing that's been introduced somewhere else, then you have a little bit of empirical evidence for what might happen. But other than that,
right, another similar like social context throughout the world, like you might see similar occurrences of things.
Like we get the cell phone first, and then we start to go under change. Our culture starts to undergo changes, and then another country, all of a sudden gets cell phone. You can probably predict what's going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. So the proliferation of the adoption of certain policies might be evidence that it would be successful elsewhere. Okay. So moving on then to his fourth principle, that he states very plainly, like you cannot design on paper a new society. Like you can't, because these things are so unpredictable, these mass changes to society are so unpredictable, it just feeds into like the misunderstanding, it seems, of like human nature and human unpredictability, like on a whole. Like these things can't be predicted, so that you can't design around it.
Right. I think the fourth kind of comes from the third, right? Like if something, you can't predict the consequences of something or of a major change in society, and so therefore you can't design a society on paper because everything you're designing is going to have unpredicted consequences.
Yep, exactly. And then overall, like his fifth principle, he states that which he says, I think all four of them thus leads to the conclusion that people don't consciously choose society,
right?
The society that they like just developed into.
Yeah, he gives a little example, which right. So to illustrate, by the first principle, generally speaking, an attempt at social reform either acts in the direction in which a society is developing anyway, so that it merely accelerates a change that would have occurred in any case, or else it has only a transitory effect, so that the society soon slips back into its old groove. To make a lasting change in the direction of development of any important aspect of a society, reform is insufficient and revolution is required. A revolution does not necessarily involve an armed uprising or the overthrow of a government. By the second principle, revolution never changes only one aspect of a society, it changes the whole society. And by the third principle, changes only that were never expected or desired by the revolutionaries. By the fourth principle, when revolutionaries or utopians set up a new kind of society, it never works out as planned. I don't think he's saying anything that most people would disagree with. I think these are pretty, I don't know. Yeah, it's like sort of true by definition. Like given his definitions of these principles, I don't think anything he said here is unfair or an inaccurate broad stroke of society.
Yeah, I had a lot of this paragraph highlighted.
Yeah.
108, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. He then shits on the American Revolution a little bit.
Yeah, what's he say about that?
He pretty much just categorized it as the American Revolution was not so much a revolution as it was a war for independence, because it wasn't a true revolution in many ways, right? That things were progressing in such a way in the UK, and that he didn't say it really, but that the like colonizing an empire of theirs was coming to an end, seemingly short or something, and that representative like parliaments and democracies like the U.S. That really wasn't too novel of a thing. That was where that's where things were progressing anyway. America was likely going to be, in the typical sense, like the liberal democracy kind of thing, like pro-business and, a lot of these like, I think what he would say are like these fraudulent like ideas of freedom. Like that was a kind of inevitable. And
right.
Like the revolution, American revolutionaries were not real revolutionaries.
Right, because they weren't doing it for Was it their own interest? He wasn't. They weren't
He
doing
said
it
the
for their
founding
own
fathers
freedom.
didn't change
Yeah.
the direction of development of American society, nor did they aspire to do so. They only freed the development of American society from what he calls the retarding effect of British rule.
Okay. Without major alterations, to be sure, there is no doubt that the founding fathers took a very important step, but it was a step along the road that the English-speaking world was already traveling. Okay, so he's just saying that this stuff would have happened in the
It would have happened anyway. Maybe not necessarily in America itself, but this was the trend historically.
The proof is that Britain and all of its colonies that were populated predominantly by people of British descent ended up with his systems of representative democracy, essentially similar to that of the United States. If the founding fathers had lost their nerve and declined to sign the Declaration of Independence, our way of life today would not have been any significantly different. Maybe we would have somewhat closer ties to Britain, and we would have had a parliament and prime minister instead of a Congress and president. No big deal. Thus, the American Revolution provides not a counterexample to our principles, but a good illustration of them.
I think he's on point with this.
Yeah.
This was the most profound thing I think he said throughout the whole thing, in terms of the one that made me be like, ooh, buddy. Like, I see what you're saying, but ooh, boy. Okay, so he starts by talking about like the First Amendment, especially with regard to the freedom of the press, right? They serve a role, or they should serve a role of, being custodians of like truth, liberty, all that shit, right? And questioning power. But that sort of constitutional freedom doesn't really speak to something that really affects the average individual.
Right, which I think is a fair point. How often are you using your freedom of speech?
Or freedom of press.
Right, yeah, yes.
Right. As an individual, its effects on you are minimized, let's say. Sorry. And then he makes a point that, like, very Chomsky-esque about how mass media is largely controlled by a few organizations, and it's hard to, in many ways, shine them in a good light, to say politely.
Yeah. What's he say?
He says they're integrated into the system, like these large media organizations. So it's not like they're doing you any favors. They're part of this behemoth that he rejects. And he concludes that thought by saying, with regard to making like your speech known.
Yeah, right. Yes, this part is probably the most controversial part of the essay.
I'm not surprised, because
I would think this is probably the most controversial part of the essay.
I'm just going to read it all then. So he says, to make an impression on society with words is therefore almost impossible for most individuals and small groups. Take us. He's speaking in this like we, and there's this use of FC in this book. I'm not sure what it stands for. But he uses it I don't want to say frequently, but it's there.
Yeah, I've seen it too.
And
I didn't know
I'm
what
unsure
it was.
what it is. So he says, take us FC, for example. If we had never done anything violent and had submitted the present writings to a publisher, they probably would not have been accepted. If they had been accepted and published, they probably would not have attracted many readers, because it's more fun to watch the entertainment put out by the media than to read a sober essay. Even if these writings had many readers, he's referring to this book, this manifesto, most of these readers would soon have forgotten what they had read, as their minds were flooded by the mass of material to which the media exposed them. This is the point when I was like, oh, what am I doing with this show here? What am I putting into the world? This is not contributing in a positive way to mass media. That's where I was like, oh boy. And then the next thing was like, ooh.
Well, we're doing our part.
We're doing our part and not doing this next part. In order to get our message before the public with some chance of making a lasting impression, we've had to kill people.
think there's two parts. Does he have a point with this assessment? Is it accurate? And then also, would it be justified? Too is a second consideration. The first part, well, I mean, his name is still thrown about quite a deal, and honestly, like in more recent times, I feel like I've heard it referenced more and more, just like in the general consciousness.
His name?
Yeah,
Ted.
Yeah, just like on stupid podcasts and stuff. Like, just I feel like
it's kind of like that obsession with the Dormer, the cop who
right, exactly.
Cops.
Like
Dorner, right? Not Dormer.
I mean, it's literally like half of those shootings motivations. He was like, "Oh, I'll be remembered," right? And then people are like, "Oh, don't say their name. Don't give them the satisfaction," stuff like that. Because generally speaking, I guess that is the truth. You kill someone, like your name or whatever you did, or if you did something specifically or killed someone for a very specific reason, that reason will be remembered. If only, I think, just to honor the dead. Like,
yeah, I think there's generally in society more respect for the dead than the murderer. Yeah.
So basically, just the general historical trend of technologies is to impose more and more on your freedom. And it's never been the case where more technology has meant less imposition on you by technology, because that's just a contradiction. The more technology progresses, the more it's going to be ingrained and integrated.
And this is why I think
against your will.
And this is why he comes back to genetic, like, technology and gene editing, I think. So, I mean, I want to say frequently, he does come back to it. I think he understands it to be like the next step, like this is of course going to happen. I touched on this earlier with the twin thing in China, but he sees this as the next permanent technological change. But I think he sees it, whether or not he says it as like a step too far, like he sees it as a line, or maybe he's just conveying that it's easy to see as the next line that like we should not cross, like on comparable to nukes. He doesn't say that, but in terms of scale and of what he worries about, he sees gene editing technology as like
it's like the end goal where it's all headed, and like that's
right, because the technology has affected you maybe through the environment in the past, say with like through the early industrial age, in cities with breathing and smog
pollution a lot. Yeah.
Gene editing is a permanent change, and it's now actually taking effect on the human body itself. Like it's something that once you start it, there's no turning back. And it might even propagate itself.
How do you mean?
Like biologically,
that's right. If you have your genes edited, then you have a kid. They're gonna inherit your edited genes, or how does it work?
Perpetuity.
Right. Exactly. So that's what I said earlier. Right. It's not just one person. It's a whole. Every descendant of that person who had it,
right, and at no expense other than the normal sustaining of the system that already sustains the population, right? You can't have a technologically advanced society, as he would put it, without a baseline that allows and that's like what I would say the working class, like maybe he would determine like the infrastructural class, like the things that make the system like minimal effort. Maybe that's his framing of it, like this infrastructural class rather than the working class, like part of the society that makes it effortless for other humans to function by way of providing cheap, shelter. Well, shelter's not cheap, but let's just say
affordable
food.
Yeah.
Like
or food, yeah.
Food and water.
Yeah.
And the individuals that make that, the logistics and the growth of whatnot to sustain basic human function, right? But there's infrastructure behind that. The infrastructure behind propagating genetic alterations is literally the system itself, just sustaining that further. You can't, once a gene is edited, right? All you're doing is then feeding that child food from the system that's already in place. You are feeding it potential training by way of education for getting it ready for the labor market, right? Nothing need change about the actual already existing society to make that new technology. There's a physical infrastructure to the internet. The technology behind gene editing just literally exists within the cells of that human being. No extra energies must be expended to sustain that. It's like this for him. I think he thinks this perfect, like
I didn't think about it like that.
Perfect weapon. Like not that technology as a collective is conscious in any way, shape, or form or sense, but
technology. Well, I think it does follow, or at least he's trying to argue it follows his 5 principles.
But I'm not saying like the technology would become like
sentient.
No,
Sure.
I'm not saying like an AI. But that is just the ultimate next step. It's in essence think of it as in his view of technology, almost like a biological weapon from which technology is attacking the human race. But it's more so, I think, what we would see as like the capitalist class imposing its will through technology to, I think, a lot of conservatives would think is like the enslavement of humankind by technologists. And what he sees through gene editing as like the ultimate like humanity, like weapon against humanity, not just a weapon of mass destruction, but a weapon from which there's no coming back.
Oh, yes. Okay, that I agree with, because I think based on, like, I was just thinking about this gene editing through just the 5 principles of history that he just laid out. And if you look at it through that, okay, so the first one doesn't really apply, but then, well, just really his 4th one, that unintended consequences, that you can't know all the bad stuff that can happen when you make a big change. And editing someone's DNA, I think, is easily arguably a big change to make in someone. You can't know all the bad stuff that's going to happen. And not only that, well, like you said, any bad changes are going to propagate, for one. So it's going to be a much larger issue than you think. Right, as long as that person has kids and their kids has kids, it's just going to go on until until the end of that family tree. But because you don't know what could go wrong, what was I going to say?
Well, the consequences are that you can't predict.
Yeah, you can't predict it, and not only that. So with like that example he gives of like a utopian society that tries to impose its own, rules, and then it gets all these unintended consequences. That's pretty much what's going to happen with this. You're going to have scientists with the best of intentions who are saying they're doing this for the good of humanity, who are going to then change genes, and bad shit's going to happen. And it's just going to get worse, because then also this is a technology based on his other stuff that will eventually be forced on most people, or highly encouraged, because it's the moral thing to do, and you're over socialized and inclined to do what the moral thing to do that society says is the moral thing to do. You have to go get your DNA edited if you don't want your kid to come out at a disadvantage to all the other kids who are already having their DNA edited. That's eventually what it'll boil down to. It's like you don't want to be at a disadvantage because everyone else is doing it, or at least that's what it will be sold as. Like, that's the easiest way. That's how most people get sucked into most of these technological things, is like you can't be the person who doesn't have a cell phone, right? Like, it's, at least I'm not saying that is good rationale to have a cell phone, but that is definitely one of the strongest arguments for having a cell phone, right? It is how
massively useful tool,
right?
Like for just say navigation.
You tell someone that you don't have a cell phone and they look at you like, you're crazy. Like, you don't even have a flip phone. Like, everyone has some means of mass communication on them at all times now. That is just a given. Now, within that, there's a range. Like, people who have, like the newest iPhone will look at someone with a flip phone and like, are you like kidding? Like, but I think that's not having it at all, or not having a landline, or not having, like, imagine that, not having even a landline, not having a cell phone and not having a landline.
Say 20 years ago,
right?
I think that's believable.
Mm-hmm. Now that starts to feel weird, like, because even someone not having a cell phone or having a cell phone on them is pretty not having your cell phone on you is understandable, like everyday thing for a lot of people. Not owning one is weird, but not having any, like, no cell phone.
I commend you for that. That's an admirable feat to have achieved in this year.
That seems insane, right? It just seems like, because a lot of people, you're born and that technology is already existing. So just, you're now subtracting something that you've come to just take as a normal part of your life, and you can't go backwards like that.
In talking about like restrictions on freedoms, he mentions like that the system has to force people into behaviors that are remote to what is natural for like a human being. Like the system.
Does he give an example of that, or what number is that?
115. This is leading up to like, voting, like having like, you're not really having effect as an individual.
Oh, is this when he calls kids computer nerds?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, he uses that a couple times. I actually think it's really funny.
He's just saying like, he's shitting on like engineering and science and math as being kind of like phony and saying that kids just want to go play outside.
Yeah, but he only throws mathematicians in there like once, because otherwise it's like scientists doing research, and engineers he shits on a lot. But this is, I think, one of the only times he shits on mathematicians too. For example, the system needs scientists, mathematicians, and engineers. It can't function without them. So heavy pressure is put on children to excel in these fields. It isn't natural for an adolescent human being to spend the bulk of his time sitting at a desk absorbed in study. He gives a citation. A normal adolescent wants to spend his time in active contact with the real world. Among primitive peoples, the things that children are trained to do tend to be in reasonable harmony with natural human impulses. Among the American Indians, for example, boys are trained in active outdoor pursuits, just the sort of things that boys like. But in our society, children are pushed into studying technical subjects, which most do grudgingly. Right. So this is just, I think, more about like the lack of autonomy we have in like choosing, because we have to. I think this also goes back to the power process not being given to you by the system, because scientists, mathematicians, engineers, these are ways for you to do the power process that the system's offering to you. But the fact that you have to choose from this list already takes away any satisfaction you could get out of the power process.
It betrays the PB.
Yeah. Yes, it does.
And this is where he leads into reform, bad, revolution, only acceptable answer. We kind of covered what was said in 129, but jumping ahead to 130, he just concludes that to fight each of the threats of like certain technologies or like reforms, to fight each of them separately is futile. So like thinking like, social reform, like organizations say, like the ACLU, who fights for like gay rights now, like in like recent years, I think, and then like say women and voting rights and stuff like that. I think he's saying that those kind of meaningful, but in the grand scheme of things, not like the most impactful. Obviously, women earning the right to vote is massively impactful. But fighting for like those individual reforms, he sees as futile.
And just not gonna
to knock them down one by one,
right,
is futile, because it's just it's just advancing this like slow technological creep, and it's not actually anything revolutionary that topples the system that was even enabling these stresses on freedom and domain over one's life.
Because it's not attacking what he views as the main culprit, the technological industrialization of modern society, it is ultimately kind of inconsequential.
And if it's not attacking what he would say is that like technological society, then it is a meaningless reform. So in that sense, he's a revolutionary. He wants to just topple the system.
What he sees as the ultimate bad part of the system. So all these other things, I guess you would probably just call like what's it called, a wedge issue, or sort of, or like just like a distraction, maybe you would.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. He does, I think, he does tend to like hedge himself appropriately at times. Like he does, like, say like a lot of things are still good and provide, better quality of life for people, but ultimately, if you're not going after the actual big bad, it's not that great. It's not getting us where we need to go.
And then he also jumps to speaking about like educators, bureaucrats, and there's one other law enforcement in particular. He notes that like each of these, like at an individual level, they might care for or say that they have concern for individual liberties and freedoms, but in particular, if we look at the law enforcement officer, they might believe in these like concepts of privacy and freedom, but he says when they're conflicted with their work, say like you're working for the NSA, right? You're part of the military intelligence and the intelligence community that is I think pretty fair to say is spying on the world. The people working for those organizations that have a sense of that privacy is an inherent good that should be a human right. They're willing to, at least, within their own psyche, somehow, there's a cognitive dissonance, right? And they, in essence, end up reinforcing the technological system that enabled the surveillance, right? That they're more like devoted to their work and the advancement of the technological, like progressive industrial society that he sees. Even if he's just saying that there's individuals who can break the allegiance from like humanity to more the technological like society that he deems bad. So law enforcement officers, they might praise and preach, we're all about protecting privacy and whatnot. Meanwhile, they're obviously stepping over lines that shouldn't be stepped over.
Right. Yes.
And they're serving technology. They're not serving humanity.
Yeah.
But he likens that to other like people like bureaucrats too.
Yeah.
Where it's maybe like less in your face.
I think here too, he says scientists and people who work in science are basically the same too. Like they work, I mean, kind of by definition, they're working on technology.
He is also hopeful in a way that he says in several decades, the system will be undergoing severe stress due to economic and environmental problems, especially due to problems of human behavior. So he says alienation, rebellion, hostility, a variety of other social and psychological difficulties. So he doesn't think things are going to go well for people generally in society because of the current environment. And he continues that we hope that the stresses through which the system is likely to pass will cause it to break down, or at least will weaken it sufficiently so that a revolution against it becomes possible. I mean, these seem to be like point of fact to him, and like a lot of it, it's hard to, I don't know, it's hard to refute. I'm not saying that
I mean, he's not making moral or value claims either. He's just trying to, I think, give what he views as like the most accurate picture of the world. I think he isn't, I don't know, he does talk a very matter-of-fact way where it doesn't feel like he's trying to convince you. Actually, it just sounds like he's actually trying to
convey what he thinks.
Yeah. Or like just lay out his entire thought process for himself, like make sure that every point connects. He does just kind of go one into the next. And I mean, he does write, it's pretty easy to understand what he writes. It's very simple English.
Yeah, it's definitely brief in many ways, but that's good.
Yeah.
Like he elaborates, he uses some examples of things, but it's tight. It's concise thoughts.
Yeah.
I would guess that a lot of these paragraphs were written out of order and he threw them together.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. While the industrial system is sick, we must destroy it. If we compromise with it and let it recover from its sickness, it will eventually wipe out all of our freedom. So he's saying, going back to those principles that he laid out, like if you just allow the trend of the industrial society to continue as is, all those small reforms are doing nothing. It's always, the trend is always encroaching upon your freedoms as he sees it. So that he says it just needs to stop now. That's what he wants.
Right. You getting the right to vote is good, but if nothing else is done, more and more your life is still going to be taken over by the technology. You're going to lose freedom that way. So,
he's saying that if the beast is wounded, kill it. So he's like, that's like the opportunity you need to take. He has this little like story in there about like these two landowners, right? And they have like, let's say they each have an acre, and like one day the guy who's physically stronger comes to the physically, let's say, older and weaker neighbor, bullies him into giving up half of his land. He says, I'm taking all your land, and the guy compromises. He's like, just take half and we'll be fine. And then the strong guy comes back, 6 months later.
Right.
takes another half. So what Ted is saying is that if at any point after all those concessions were made from the imperialist neighbor, if there's at any point a time to strike before you yourself die and you are consumed by this technological beast that is expressing its way through these social relations, if you have an opportunity to kill it, you need to take it. Saying if at any point that strong man, grows weak and you find his Achilles heel or something of that sort, poke it, hit him. Take back what was stolen from you. And he says, kill it. He says, if you know that he's going to come back and continue what he started, he says, kill it.
Right. Because that big man too is just all of technology, and it's
As
getting bigger every day because it's getting progressed every day. And any concession you might get, well, tomorrow there's going to be something new, another transition, a new invention, a new way to track you or whatever. Or that just as a piece of technology that's going to be imposed on you against your will, that you're going to be forced to use.
And he follows this all by saying that technology, like I think he says phones. Is that what he's talking about at some point? Like certain things, like there's no rational reason to say that phones are going to be bad. And then phones are introduced, and it fundamentally changes how communication is done.
Right.
And
had
in
those
unpredictable ways.
Right. Unintended consequences. It's just unavoidable.
And the unavoidable thing is that the freedoms are chipped away at. And that's his biggest contention. The freedom of like the domain to control one's own livelihood in the context of greater society. He says it's like technology always wins out because there are these, tangible benefits of technologies, whether it be the internet and connectivity, phones, easily accessible maps and medicines and shit. But thinking about freedoms is a much more abstract, thought kind of experiment. Talking about in these like abstract ways, like, through surveillance, we're not giving up that much freedom. No. It's far more abstract. Technology is in many ways, it's very tangible. You can hold it a lot of the times. You can interact with it.
It's not only that you're expected to be holding one, expected that you have one. That's, I think, this inescapable part of it. You can't imagine too, like, there's no going, it's not like we're going to get rid of the cell phone and on only the cell phone and everything else stays as is. Just think like that's an absurd sort of suggestion. The only way that old technology ever disappears is if it's replaced by a newer technology. That's about it. And most of the time, it doesn't necessarily just is a clean replacement, but it's just you get some synthesis between the two, right? And you get something new.
Right. Pager becomes cell phone becomes smartphone.
Right. And it just continues on and on and on. And it just, that's his main point. That just never stops. It's just, there's never a stop in the cycle of progression of technology. When's the last time anyone said that, we're not going to invent anything this year? That's just, that doesn't happen.
Well, he kind of like leads to talking about climate change just ever so briefly. And not that he's hopeful in any sense, but I guess if we're thinking about things like the oil industry and, coal and whatnot. He seems that maybe there's some slim chance that a lot of these environmental issues can be solved through some sort of rational, he says, comprehensive plan. So it's maybe something on the scale of like the UN implementing some sort of, agricultural project or something of that sort, and, changes, cattle and pork production or something of that nature, where the whole world is like producing less and, we're not driving cars anymore, something like that. Unless we're talking about something like that. So he seems like that something like that might be possible only insofar as it benefits the long-term benefits of the interests of the system. Like think about like the Matrix, right? Like the robots, right? It's in the interest of the robots to keep themselves alive, apparently. So they go to great lengths to make it happen. So if stopping global climate change is, good for business,
Right.
like if people can
Eventually,
make money off of it, the system is going to sustain itself through just changing its behaviors.
eventually it's going to affect that quarter's profits and something will be done.
Yes. This is why I also don't really this is still the 90s. Maybe he's had more time to read more, but yeah, his lack of analysis on a class or just basic, leftist thinking as we would see it, not his version of leftist, maybe more well-read in Marxism would benefit his conceptions.
I wonder what the second book is like after he's read stuff on that. But yeah, I agree it is a little bit.
Yeah. And then, all right. So to cap things off, I have the last 2 paragraphs here that I highlighted under revolution is easier than reform. He says,
what number?
141.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
A revolutionary movement can inspire an intensity of commitment that a reform movement cannot inspire. So thinking back to something like social reforms, the civil rights movement, stuff like that, a reform movement merely offers to solve a particular social problem, whereas revolutionary ones solve all those, or they could solve all of those problems at once. And in doing so, create a whole new world. And I assume he's also then implying it's a wholly unpredictable new world based on, I think, principle 3 from earlier.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. And the revolutionary model, as opposed to the reformist model, he says, provides the kind of ideal for which people will take great risk and make great sacrifices. Reform is always restrained by the fear of painful consequences if changes go too far. But once a revolutionary fever has taken hold of a society, people are willing to undergo unlimited hardships for the sake of their revolution. This was clearly shown in the French and Russian revolutions. It may be that in such cases only a minority of the population is really committed to the revolution, but this minority is sufficiently large and active so that it becomes the dominant force in society.
This is just this one's just particularly funny because if you thought his other stuff was critical of you having a podcast or making media, this one's very critical, I think, of mass media. 147. All right, I'm just gonna read this one straight. To start with, there are the techniques of surveillance. Hidden video cameras are now used in most stores and in many other places. Computers are used to collect and process vast amounts of information about individuals. Information so obtained greatly increases the effectiveness of physical coercion, i.e., law enforcement. Then there are the methods of propaganda, for which the mass communications media provides effective vehicles. Efficient techniques have been developed for winning elections, selling products, influencing public opinion. The entertainment industry serves as an important psychological tool of the system, possibly even when it is diminishing out large amounts of sex and violence. Entertainment provides modern man with an essential means of escape. While absorbed in television, videos, etc., he can forget stress, anxiety, frustration, dissatisfaction. Many primitive peoples, when they don't have any work to do, are content to sit for hours at a time doing nothing at all, because they are at peace with themselves and their world. But most modern people must be constantly occupied or entertained, otherwise they get, quote, bored, i.e., they get fidgety, uneasy, irritable.
I hope you're enjoying this episode of Content Piggies. Got Wagyu steak strips, like a Wagyu beef Slim Jim.
No. Yeah. Good stuff. This will get cut, right?